By the way, did you notice the little icon that I put on the group?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's from.
I don't know where that's from.
There is a comic adaptation of this story, believe it or not. There is a comic. Yeah, there's a comic adaptation of most of the Books of Blood. It's collated in a trade paperback called Tapping the Vein, and it's really good.
Wow.
Okay.
It's really good, actually. It's surprisingly brilliant. They lend these stories, the Books of Blood, they lend themselves really, really well to visualization.
Yeah, I can see that actually. Thinking about over the stories in the first volume, I can imagine you know getting pretty good graphic novels out of them.
Well, you tend to get like artists gravitating towards it who have highly stylized, like their styles are very abstract and idiosyncratic, and that works really well for the stories. It works really well.
Well, this one, I mean, you know, having just seen that one image that you put up, I mean, you're going to have to be a kind of Hieronymus Bosch to get close to quite a lot of the stuff in this story, aren't you? I don't know. I can't even imagine what some of those panels look like.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I was thinking about this before we came on air. As the Books of Blood go, this is far from the most lurid or the most colourful or the most visually striking. You'd refer to things like Rawhead Rex, like the Midnight Meat Train, obviously. This one is more sedate in terms of its imagery, but also more poetic. It's a fascinating. This one. I mean, Mike. I mean, Kit. You know, we've been. This is the one, isn't it? This is the one people have gone nuts over. I mean, when people learned we were doing this project, I fully expected it to be Rawhead Rex, Midnight Meat Train. You know, the ones that are the more classic horror stories, as it were. Not a bit of it.
No, we at one point, Dave, this is just a bit of background information for you. We actually started sending messages to a few people to invite them to take part in the show, and it got to the point where we were having to phrase the email, what of the Books of Blood is your favourite story apart from In the Hills Cities? Because that was the one that literally everybody was like, In the Hills Cities, like, fucking hell, man. So
well, I remember you sending me the message, Kit, and I think I took about 5 seconds to respond.
Yeah, you did. Well, you got quick, that's why you're here. You got him first.
You got him first, man. Yeah,
well, extremely flattered. You know, honestly, it's very, 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 very privileged to be here.
But this story, I mean, don't get me wrong, this is incredible. This story is, and the more I read it and the more I think about it in terms of context, when it was written, the culture in which it was written, the down and out gay guy who wrote it.
Yeah.
It's a miracle. This story is a minor miracle. All of the short stories in the Books of Blood are fascinating artifacts. They really are. This is something else. And I think with age, it's percolated, it's fermented, it's become more resonant and powerful and profound. This is the one I can't believe exists. This is the one where I come at it now and I'm like, what? I'm incredulous. I am utterly incredulous that this story A exists and B was published when it was published.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm very keen actually to hear from both of you about your histories of this story, because of course the interesting thing for me coming to this is that I mean, as you both know, as listeners know, like this is my first journey through the Books of Blood, so this is my first experience with all of these stories. So I first, I read this, I read it 3 or 4 weeks ago because we had to postpone our original recording date. So I had read it. So it's sat with me for about a month, maybe now. But I would genuinely, because I mean, it had a seismic impact on me reading it, a month ago. I'm still kind of thinking about it. I'm still churning on it. I recorded a conversation with a friend a couple of days ago on the subject of partly this story and partly another one, and I have plenty more to say. So there's obviously a lot going on with it, but what was it like to encounter? I mean, I guess for both of you, I don't know, David, maybe you want to start as the guest. Like, what age were you when this crossed your consciousness, and how? Like, what were the circumstances?
No, happy to start. Yeah, so I bought the Books of Blood, I think, in quick succession, both of the sort of volumes 1 to 3, 4 to 5, 4 to 6 anthologies in charity shops in my mid-adolescence, sort of, I don't know, 15, something like that, I'm going to say.
Okay.
And this is when I'd already been, the topic we've talked about, Kit, I'd already been familiar with most of Stephen King's short stories for a few years at this point. So I had, I wouldn't say a thorough horror grounding, but, I'd had sort of gateway drugs injected into the system and that sort of thing. And I think I picked up Barker because I would have been becoming familiar with some of his more, filmic properties, like Hellraiser. I think I'd probably seen Hellraiser. No, I'd definitely seen Candyman. I'd seen probably the first Hellraiser. And so I was aware of him as a name, and I knew obviously he did loads of fiction, and he had all the sort of doorstop novels and everything, which I've still not delved into too deeply, but I have read some of his short fiction. But yeah, definitely started with the Books of Blood, and I was a mid-teen, and it's been really interesting listening to you guys on this series so far, go through the volume 1 so far. It's been fascinating to kind of be reminded of some of the stories in this, because I think when I was reading them, they were just such a new world, really. It's kind of one of those Dorothy stepping out of the farmhouse into full Technicolor kind of moments for me, in terms of some of the stuff you guys have discussed already, in terms of the sort of fluidity of the prose and the ideas, and I've always been into sort of weird anthology stories and everything, but just the sort of breadth of Barker's imagination and where he chooses to go in these stories. But I think towards the end of this recording, we're planning to chat a little bit about the story so far, just briefly as a sort of summing up, and have some thoughts there. But in The Hills, the Cities stuck with me on that first read. So this, I would have read them in order. So this would have been, the 5th, 6th one that I read, and two really, and we'll simplify a bit, because obviously we'll unpack it a bit. Two things: the scope and scale and nature of the horror that's on the trail here, and the gay sex.
Right.
Let's be frank about what we're talking about.
Sure.
As a 15-year-old who was starting to sort out his sexuality, I've sort of settled on bisexual as a label, and was definitely sort of both feeling through and thinking through a lot of that in my mid-teens. I think the quite brief sex scene in this was probably the first sort of fairly explicit homosexual sex scene I'd ever read in fiction. It was up there. It was one of the first, and I think there was a tremendous influence on me in terms of actually visualizing sex with the same gender, and about kind of making it real in my head, but by the idea of that, by the way Barker portrays it in this, is this kind of just very normal, relatable, but exciting act, and I think it's, I think we'll get back to that a bit, but basically that was my reaction to it, was being very, very impressed with the strength and nature of the horror, and being extremely impressed, maybe even more bowled over, by the sexual frankness.
I mean, that's very interesting to me, because one of the things that I think is, and it actually ties together something you were talking about earlier, George. You described this one as, in some ways, significantly less graphic than many of the other horror stories in this collection. And I think there's a sense in which that's true in the way in which Barker chooses to portray the horror. But I do also think that actually, when you think about the scale of what happens in this story, this is probably the bloodiest story, certainly the bloodiest story we've read so far in terms of body count. Right?
It's like a small war.
It's it's technically a small genocide, isn't it, that happens in this story, right? And that's massively deliberate. I mean, there's a whole political dimension to this story, but 100%. reining it in for the moment. I mean, really, it's so interesting hearing David talk about his experience, because it's almost exactly the same. Right. It's almost word for word exactly the same. So I read Weaveworld when I was 11. I was aware of Barker from Hellraiser and the previous film works and whatnot. Read Weaveworld, which, as everybody who's familiar with this channel knows, blew my mind just wide open. It was like taking LSD for the first time. Completely changed the topography of my mental landscape. And after that, I went out and got everything. And I just devoured, glutted myself on everything Barker had written. And the Books of Blood were amongst the first. And this one, I always remember arresting me when I came to it. And it was for exactly the reasons that David was describing. I mean, I was of a similar age, mid-teens, feeling out my own sexuality, as a putative gay man. This would have been in the 1990s, so not as bad a cultural situation as the 1980s, but still not great either. The only mention of homosexuality in schools would have been as a slur on the schoolyard. It would not have been mentioned in like sex ed classes or any kind of like social studies class or anything like that. It wouldn't have even been referred to. It wouldn't have been mentioned. So what's really interesting talking to young gay people now is the difference. Like, you had to feel out your own way. We kind of educated ourselves. We had to discover these things. And even things like, this was pre-internet as well. I mean, the internet existed, but it was really difficult to get a hold of, and households didn't have it. So we didn't have the community contact we had back then, no mobile phones or anything like that, no social media cultures, as it were, at that point. So we were scrabbling in the dark. We didn't really know much about the experience of being gay. Many of us didn't even know like that's what we were. We would have known the word, but we wouldn't have thought to apply it to ourselves. It's really bizarre in that way. That wouldn't have come until later. So discovering a story like this, which is so overt and unashamed, just completely unabashed, in a genre like horror, and not only that, but mainstream horror as well. I mean, Barker by that point was a mainstream name.
Sure.
To find this, it really was like discovering a secret world. It's like the clouds parting and finding Oz or Neverland or something. And also it had that effect of revealing to us that we could do this. Those of us who were passingly interested in writing or in fiction or whatever, we could do this. We could. It was that revelatory moment where it was like, oh, okay. So, like David, probably like yourself, Kit, up until that point, I'd read King, I'd read Campbell, I'd read loads of Coons, and I'd read Thomas Harris, and, all of the people who were considered to be iconic of the genre, most of whom are straight guys. That's just the way it is. And they write generally about straight relationships primarily. The only time like queer characters in general tend to turn up in their writings is generally as villains or victims, and most of the time, even with the best will in the world, in the 1980s and 1990s, it wouldn't have been very good. It wouldn't have been very well portrayed. It never was. So to find this, where you've got a sincere dissection of real gay men having real gay relationships, was revelatory. I mean, it was just just blossoming in the mind. Really, really strange experience.
I mean, there's a lot in there I want to pick up on, but one of the things that immediately occurred to me was I was thinking about points of comparison in terms of the, when I started talking about the horror of the death of the city, and yet how it's relatively, I guess, discreetly portrayed in a way. Yes. And I think what I'm struck by, because, both of you highlighting the sex scene, to me, it's fascinating because on my reading through, I was struck by it's clear what's happened. It's very clear, but it's actually, I thought it was interesting. I want to say it was tenderly written. That's not quite right, but it wasn't. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not actually pornographic.
No, not at all. No. This is, I mean, most of it is implication, isn't it? It's kind of couched in this, I wouldn't say cautious language as such, although that's probably true. It is quite cautious in that regard, because, of course, I mean, even at this time, and even Barker wouldn't have gotten away with anything more florid. He would have definitely had an editor breathing down his neck. I'll bet he did for this story in particular, saying you can't do that, make them straight, make one of them a woman, I mean, but of course that would have diluted the story completely, because that's not what it's about.
But it's interesting though, isn't it, because it's frank enough that you know what's going on, and I think the final line is really actually quite strong. I mean, that's the one where he kind of lands it, if you like, when he describes the the flavor of the kiss afterwards, and you're like, okay, all right.
Absolutely,
okay.
I imagine for readers at the time that was really shocking. I mean, it's not now, obviously. I mean, there's entire because of the work Barker did, because of that like pilgrim-like work that he and others did, opening up these trails for us. they're entire subsections of queer horror now. I happily account myself amongst those subcultures, which are lurid and florid, and you can get, if you want to go and get yourself your collection of homoerotic Lovecraftian eldritch horror short stories, go thou forth to Amazon and type that in, and you'll find them. Yeah. But that's because of stories like this. It's because stories like this paved the way. And at the time, in the late 1980s, that would have been lurid and graphic and shocking.
But I also just think it speaks to Barker's skill as a writer, because he will go on to write much more graphic sex scenes in Imagica in particular. I think there's
absolutely. I mean, specifically homosexual, he would have been in Sacrament. Yeah,
right. Yeah, but it's fascinating to me both that it struck the two of you at the age you've read it as powerfully as it did, and I wonder the degree to which that speaks to the paucity of available material, which would be part of the issue, of course, and how much of it actually does speak again, though, to Barker's skill as a writer, that it still felt incredibly, it still felt very charged, even though he takes I would say, relatively subtle approach. I mean, it's not subtle, what's happened.
Oh, yeah.
It's not circumspect either, really. It's very, this is where Barker's good, I think. And again, it mirrors his description later on of the atrocity in the city, where you know exactly what's happened. But a lot of it is done, as you say, by implication. A couple of very important telling details. I think for me, the bit that struck me about that scene is actually, it's not the sex scene itself, it's the precursor to it. It's the moment when one of the two men just sort of realizes, I've figured out how I can head off this argument.
Yes, that
maybe saves this holiday.
Well, it's amazing, isn't it?
Very real to true human life.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, doesn't it just? I mean, this is another thing that's really revealing about this story. I mean, Barker's doing something really subtle here, I think. What he's trying to do is kind of what Russell T Davies did with Queer as Folk. He's trying to demonstrate that, these are just people.
Yeah,
they're just people, and they're doing what people do. They're having exactly the same problems that everyone else is having. The fact that you've got queer characters in a horror short story at this time who are not archetypes or stereotypes, and in fact are very diverse. They're very unusual. I mean, you look at Judd, for example, who's really out of left field, which is ironic given that he's described as to the right of Attila the Hun.
Right wing,
but that very notion, right, in the 1980s, you've got a right wing queer journalist character.
No, absolutely, and I love the way that the two of them in the opening two paragraphs, and again we're back to Barker breaking the head hopping rule, because the opening two sections are, you get both perspectives on the relationship. It's particularly fun because I think when I start reading it and I start reading about how boring Judd is according to his partner, I keep that, my immediate, with my understanding of the wider context of Barker's work, is like, oh, okay, so this is one of Barker's kind of, one of Barker's bête noire kind of figures, right? The right wing ball. But then he immediately leaps over to Judd, gives him interiority, gives him, and you sort of sympathise a little bit with him as well. You're like,
it's hard to say. Certainly by the end of the story, I think it's really hard to say which of the characters Barker has more sympathy for and more identification with. I mean, in terms of his inclinations and nature, Mick would obviously be the more obvious author insert.
Yeah,
but.
Well, he clearly finds things to admire and annoy in both men, and I like that. I like that.
That's another thing about this story, isn't it? There isn't a bad guy in this story. There isn't
there isn't
even really a nefarious force as such. Well, I mean, we can discuss that, I suppose. I just wanted to say on the well, I suppose firstly on the language. I mean, you talk about the interiority of Mick and Judd. Did you guys both notice they both use the term queens? But Mick uses it in he refers to other queens back at the resort where they've just come from, and in a sort of more of a sort of solidarity kind of way, I guess that's the sense you get from him. Whereas Judd uses it definitely dismissively. He's almost and he's almost apologetic about it, even in his own head, isn't he? He's like, I'm sorry, but that's the only way to describe him.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, this is something that really fascinates me about this story on the rereadings. It's the politics of it. It's the internal politics of the relationship, the two characters, and then you have the much wider sort of mythological commentaries on politics in general. So you have a queer character in Judd who is really complex. He is simultaneously part of the machinery that is making life for queer men in particular, but queer people in general, certainly in the UK, much more difficult. He is a right-wing journalist at that time. So he's kind of like, I mean, he has the quality of a traitor, you know, in many respects. And then you have Mick, who is he's much more of an artistic Fae character. He's more victim-like in many respects.
I mean, I think that's interesting, but I also think that the way Barker finesses the right-wing journalist character in this is, of course, they're in a Iron Curtain country at the time that this is going on, and it's, you know, there was it's one of the things that I think Orwell was very good on, was about, I mean, there's some very famous work by Orwell where he castigates kind of British left-wingers who didn't appreciate that Stalinism was actually kind of bad, not communism, and as you might expect it to be in a kind of philosophical way. And I think that there was in the 80s, there probably still is, a strain of like knee-jerk lefty, for want of a better way of putting it, that's just like, oh well, yeah, you know, they're, you know, East versus West, will kind of reflexively side against American Western imperialism at all times. And we're seeing this playing out at the moment with some of the more, you know, unfortunate things happening in some of the, you know, it's a fringe of a fringe really on the left, but I have to acknowledge it exists, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
In current conflicts where you're just like, well, okay, but Russian imperialism isn't actually any better at all, and Putin's human rights record is in fact even worse than America's, which is dreadful. So, you know, and also when there's a war of aggression, frankly, you side with the people being invaded. You know, I mean, that's just basic, you know,
what you do, right?
As far as I'm concerned. But it's interesting. So, like, I think there is a layer of subtlety, as you say, like on paper, although Judd is clearly the villain, actually, because of the time and the place and the wider circumstances, not quite as black and white as it looks. It's just fascinating to me, because it seems to me the story on having reread it so many times in recent weeks, it seems to be about positionality to me. That's really what it's getting at. The circumstances in which these two characters find themselves is very deliberate. There's a reason why it's Yugoslavia. I mean, a country that doesn't actually exist anymore as a result of a war that would have been happening shortly after this publication, right? Which is fascinating in and of itself. But it's because setting it in a sort of Eastern European country, he can make commentaries upon the positionality of gay men, and not just gay men, but sort of outsiders in general, to structures of tradition, which is what Podoyevo and Popolak actually are. They are sort of like folkloric, tradition-made manifest, right? To the point whereby all individuality is subsumed into them. What if the Wicker Man? But without the wicker, just
without the wicker, right?
So and it can move.
It's utterly and it can move, exactly that. I mean, first of all, the image, the concept is kind of ludicrous, isn't it?
It's a thing that I mean, you know, this has happened time and time again in this series, right? We've just looked at this story, you know, we've looked at the idea and just gone like, where did that come from? I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about in terms of like, I mean, this is what I love about what Barker does. He knows enough about genre that all of his stories, or many of his stories, are rooted in the absolute classics, right? You know, the urban horror of Midnight Meat Train. You've got the Deal with the Devil story. You know, instantly became one of my favorite Deal with the Devil stories of all time.
Well, this is Wheatley, isn't it? This is folk horror, right?
Right. Well, yeah, exactly, and it's classic kind of. I mean, actually, if you think about it, there's nothing that the movie Hostel does that this story doesn't do better. Right?
Exactly that.
And 30 years earlier as well. So I mean, it makes it a complete redundancy. But
that's an interesting thing to compare it to. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
Well, I actually, while we're talking about antecedents, I think this will come up a bit more. But Kit, I was thinking, I guess this kind of goes back to the sort of road trip and the couple on a road trip thing. But I was thinking very much going back, I guess, 10 years before this. You've got Stephen King's Children of the Corn.
Yes.
You know, it's because this feels very much like a version of that. You know, where a couple goes into, you know, the rural hinterland basically and discovers something they weren't meant to, you know, to discover about you know, these old rituals and this sort of older thing brought back into the modern world. You know,
I actually wondered if Barker had read it, because there's a moment where they go into the corn. And it very much felt to me like a nod, because that's the other thing as well, as like Barker's so good at playing with your expectations. Like we know that in horror fiction in general, the couple that go off to have public sex are not long for this world, right? And normally it's something's going to come out of the corner and get them, right? And it's it's due punishment for for public fornication is dismemberment, and that's pretty standard stuff. And of course this is gay sex, so
exactly to the power of N, right?
Punishment cubed, right? Like here we go. It's
also gay sex in a foreign country which is highly traditionalist and highly conservative,
risks, right? They even talk about it, like the characters internally think about the risk involved in what they're doing. They're not naive about what they're doing at all, and I think that's really interesting too. But yeah, what I love about it is that's Barker's setting you up, but as David says, actually there's no villain here, there's no monster here of the traditional variety, and the
monster here is vast and historical. The monster here is tradition.
It's history. Well, I would also note at this point that Mick and Judd are going into this secluded area to do this, this thing for pleasure that involves two bodies grappling with each other. That has to be hidden from other human sight.
Oh, right, yeah.
As above, so below, right?
Echoes within echoes within echoes, right?
God damn. Yeah. I mean, like, do you think Barker, like, do you think he's like when he wrote this? Do you think he was operating on that kind of level consciously? Because it's there. There's no question in my mind about it. I mean, I hadn't really thought of it until David just said it, but it's obviously there. And yet, how, like, do we think when he sat down and wrote this, like, he really, like, he knew that? Or is this just the power of an incredibly strong subconscious that just understands instinctively what elements to reach through and how they fit together? Because
I have no idea. But so with that in mind, I was just thinking scenes like this. I suppose this is before we move fully off, talk about the sex scene, but I just want to keep linking it back into what happens later in the story. I think there's a way, Kit, you sort of suggested it there. There's ways in which this is working on a highly metaphorical level, on a poetic level, on a sexual level, and a titillating level. And part of that titillation is, this is a scene you were talking before about, couples fornicating in the wild and being seen through the corner and stuff. This, you could add a into this, couldn't you? I mean,
yeah, definitely.
The mid-80s.
It's kind of what you would expect, isn't it?
Yeah.
Knowing that you're reading a horror story, a mainstream horror story, you've got your characters going off to have sex in the cornfield in the foreign country, which is highly conservative, which has, different cultures and traditions to our own and whatnot. The gay couple, that's what you'd expect, right?
Yeah, but George, as teenagers, found it, fascinating and titillating. It's functioning like a Friday the 13th scene. It's doing the job of one of those things. So Barker's using all this, what you might call kind of pulp, low horror, cinematic horror kind of visual stuff alongside all the grander design stuff.
All this stuff in. He's referencing Dennis Wheatley. He's referencing Friday the 13th. He's referencing Stephen King. It's just going and going and going, and then you get that other shift as well, because this one, again, it's that whole thing of him breaking all the rules. Yep. Suddenly, you're not even with them anymore. No. You leave them behind. And suddenly, you are in the head of an individual, but you're also in the head of a community. Someone whose personality is kind of subsumed into community and culture, which is entirely the point.
And I love those first early sequences. I mean, when you get to the cities, firstly because the seeds of what is to come are sown immediately.
And very subtly, right? It's very subtle, where he talks about, like, oh, which one is it? I can't remember which city it is, but it's like, oh, well, the woman who used to organise it, she sadly passed away, so it's passed to her daughter now, who is not quite as experienced, she hasn't quite bought into the mythology with the same passion as her mother did, and that's the weakness, right? That's the weakness that's bringing it all down.
The older lady is described as having fierce opinions and fiercer proportions, which is one of the best descriptions I've ever
read. So it's the child who doesn't quite believe in the myths of her culture.
Well, and it's the line is the gentler daughter who cannot coax and bully and inspire the citizens into their places. I mean, that's really... Right. And again, if you think about the history of the country of the setting here, that's actually quite, that's a very interesting choice of words.
So, isn't it? I mean, you talked about earlier, Kit, is this conscious or subconscious? I kind of go up and down on that. I don't know. Reading it, sometimes I think this is just Barker letting it go. It's Barker just trusting to his own imagination and to the intelligence of his own inspirations. on the other hand, there are elements of this story where the wording is so well crafted and so deliberate, where it seems to be getting at something, where I'm thinking this has got, maybe that came later, maybe that came in the editing, I don't know, but it feels conscious, doesn't it? It feels sharp enough and poignant enough to be conscious.
Yeah, I know you guys have talked before about the Ramsey Campbell endorsement of the Books of Blood, and I note that this is one of the lines that he picks out to sweeten people for the collection, the vast and mad and deathless line.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely, it's extraordinary. But the other thing that I like about that scene, I really enjoy, is the way Barker the way he draws almost entirely by inference what's going on.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me because it's not really mysterious. I think fairly quickly you kind of get the sense of what they're doing.
Yeah.
And the mind-boggling insanity of it. But I loved it because I read it, when I was reading it the first time through, I remember thinking at a certain point, because you cut back between the couple and the two cities a couple of times before the catastrophe happens, and I got to a certain point where I thought, man, he's not actually going to describe this thing fully. It's never going to be, as it were, on camera. It's all going to be done through inference. I thought, that's really bold, man. That's really bright, and it works because you can visualize what's going on. You can work it out, and again, he's trusting to the intelligence of the reader to a degree. But I also love how then and then in the last 3 pages he's like, no, here we go, and it's, what it reminded me of, one of my favorite, I think I feel is slightly underrated kind of creature feature, Cloverfield.
Yes.
You know how you go the whole movie and you never see that thing, you never see it clearly, it's always occluded, it's always there's dust or there's buildings or whatever, and then you finally, right in the last 3 minutes of the film, get that one incredible awe-inspiring shot, and I feel like this is very much in the same mold, where I'd been convinced that he wasn't going to show it, if you see what I mean, and I was okay with that. And then he did, and I was like, "Oh my
it's there, God, right? It's lurid in the moonlight."
I think Cloverfield is such a good describer, and I've just realised, I'm not saying this would be a good idea, but I've just realised you could so remake this as a found footage thing, couldn't you?
Absolutely.
The scale of it, and as you say, that occluding of the scale. I mean, Kit, I was mentioning to you in messaging about sort of kaiju fantasies, and I want to unpick some of that, especially when we talk about the ending of the story. But I think the cities of Poplac and Pontejevo, they kind of function for me on the level of kind of almost like the original King Kong, where the scale can kind of vary in my imagination, scene to scene, based on what he's describing.
Yeah, it has. This is another touchstone. Absolutely, this is another touchstone. This has all the elements of one of those films. It has all the elements of it, because they are a kind of folk horror in and of themselves often. King Kong certainly is.
Yeah.
But this does that amazing thing of removing the monster, of removing the sense of the other. These things, as vast and ludicrous as they are entirely familiar. They are cultures, they are communities, they are people.
I mean, that's what's interesting, isn't it? Because does it do that, or does it throw into relief the sense of the other? I mean, I find myself thinking about what this story is trying to tell us about culture and about difference within culture. It's very clear that, I mean, one of the many things I think that's very interesting about the story is that I don't get any sense at any point that Barker stands in judgment of the cities and of this ritual. He observes it, he describes it, but there's no point at which I feel like his authorial thumb is on the scale in terms of morality. But I do think there's something very challenging about it. I think for me, I think about, we're in this very interesting space now politically, and it's the vast majority of it, I think, is very, very good, where we are more respectful of difference, not just not just kind of tolerant, but actually respectful of differences, and
even celebratory of difference, right?
And I think overwhelmingly that's a good thing for humanity. But I do think occasionally you run into these cultural limit cases, where, for me, I'm less interested in the cultural history of a practice than an aspect of the practice that I just don't like or agree with or think is moral myself, right?
Yep.
And those, the get out of jail free card I've got is those are inherently, those always tend to be like conservative So that's always why, like, well, it's, if you were just good lefties, you wouldn't have the problem. But it is there, right? And there is this tension that we kind of don't talk about very much nowadays, because we're all so kind of keen to all get along, and so we should. But I think every now and then, and again, you hit a hard wall with it when it comes to, for example, gay rights in certain cultures, in certain countries in the world at the moment, where it's not where it should be. And things like that. And I think it's interesting because, for me, as I say, Barker doesn't stand in judgment of the culture that creates these two cities doing what they do. But I think it is intended to be profoundly alienating to the reader.
I was thinking in terms of I suppose there's a little placeholder here for further conversation. I think you could argue about how much Barker approves of the ritual of the cities as it's meant to go, and then what he thinks about the ritual as it does go.
Right.
Because obviously those are two different things, and I feel like he falls in love with one of them whilst describing the other.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? He's wrangling with very particular tensions, and I think I get the impression that through the act of writing, he is wrangling with these difficulties in himself. On the one hand, he is in love with the mechanisms and the craft and the scale and beauty of what's being done here within the story. On the other hand, there is obviously a part of him which would be appalled by the conservatism of it, the fact that individuality is suppressed in these cultures. In fact, I mean, there's even the suggestion that people are sort of like fed and developed and bred to be parts of these engines, right? There are contortionists who are the ligaments, there are these big guys who are the bases of the feet to take the weight of those on top of them, it's a fascinating commentary, and he never lets you get away with an easy answer.
Well, there is that horror, isn't there? But as you guys have treated already in these episodes, Barker is a practiced and devoted maker of theatre, and that's kind of on another level what these people are doing. They're all getting together and creating this phenomenal performance, and one with kind of fairly obvious kind of transgressive elements. It describes it at one point as an insane collective bondage game, which obviously is a perspective of the protagonist as well. But I think that the other thing that I didn't want to get away from this, that kind of possible horror of Barker's, and maybe many of us at these sort of collective celebrations, the times when as a society we do come together in crowds, maybe with people that we maybe don't have a tremendous amount in common with, but we've decided to do this collective ritual, everything from sort of bonfire night to what I was thinking was football. And that's partly because when I read it as a teenager, I remember thinking of, apart from the sort of various tribalisms and nationalisms you can see being played out here, one of the things it reminded me of was that sort of thing about football when it came on as a medieval pastime, when it was like village against village and just played by people running at each other trying to get a ball 8 miles down the road by any means necessary. But I guess maybe this is a bit of a placeholder as well, Kit, but I was just thinking, if you start to talk about football, you're talking about, not when this was published, obviously, but you're getting into things like Hillsborough, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, I mean, bizarrely, the imagery of this echoes, right?
The danger of having so many people together in a space doing something which isn't natural in a sense, which is an amalgamation of humans at a dangerous level,
Yeah, and I think I was just looking up the dates. I think it also predates the Heysel Stadium disaster, which was 85. So there's echoes, because I've just wondered if maybe, our minds obviously immediately go to Hillsborough because of probably because of our, perhaps partly because of our political leanings, because of our proximity to it geographically and all that kind of thing. Because Heysel predated Hillsborough, and in fact was important because what happened at Heysel was part of what laid the groundwork for the big lie that the right-wing press were able to deliver on Hillsborough when that disaster happened later. But no, Heisel's 85, so this story predates even that. But of course there would have been other disasters. There always are, where large groups of people gather together sooner or later. That's interesting when you were saying that, David. I was thinking about the which Barker will have been very aware of in 84, of course, the proud and ancient British tradition of football hooliganism as well, and the firms, the gathering of the firms, and there's a way in which this there's echoes of that in here. But I think the thing that gets to me about it, the bit that I find almost impossible to completely unpick, but I find fascinating, is the symbolism regarding the you were talking about earlier, George, the sublimation of the self into the whole.
Yeah.
The idea that you become part of a bigger organism, and it's interesting to me because there's ways in which that feels almost like a caricature of the critique of communism, right? Mm-hmm. As a mode of government, and it's worth bearing in mind, of course, when Barker's writing this in '84, the only form of government I think we've got that's calling itself communist is Stalinism. Right. And Stalinism is not something I recognise as a left-wing government in any way, shape, or form. I don't recognise either the philosophies that underpinned it or the way in which it conducted itself as being in any meaningful way left-wing or socialist. So you can call yourself a communist in the same way that the South Korea can call it, North Korea can call itself a democratic republic of North Korea.
Exactly. Yeah.
If no one actually gets to vote, then it's not. I mean, we call ourselves a democracy as well, and we're not. So whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like, what the fuck ever. But I do think it's interesting that it feels like it has. There's clearly, to me, echoes of that. And again, when you look at the geography and the history of the place that it's set in, then, the allegories there are obvious. But what complicates it for me is the fact that, as you said, David, you imply, like, Barker clearly kind of falls in love with the idea.
Yeah.
And so does at least one of the characters by the end.
Yes, Mick. Yeah, this is the whole thing, right? The way Barker describes the giants is so ambiguous. It's so incredibly ambiguous, and I think that, as you're sort of implying it, that echoes his ambiguity about what he's commenting upon and critiquing, which is ultimately society, culture, it's collective systems, right? What you've got here is. It's horror that's multi-pronged. It's not just the inevitable failure of this tradition and the madness of Popolac, which makes it into this rampaging giant. It's also the horror before any of that ever occurs. It's the horror of the conception, but also it's beautiful. This is an amazing thing, right? And also when he's describing how the people feel about this, right? This is the grandest thing. This is what they live for. Yeah. This is beautiful. It's fulfilling. It's what they are. It's everything to them,
and they're becoming literally something bigger by doing
exactly. It, so. There's almost like an apotheosis happening here, right? They are becoming gods bestriding the land, and the fact that you've got two gay characters who are outsiders in every conceivable way. They're not only outsiders, but they're foreigners who don't speak the language. They're tourists. They're lost. They don't know where they are. They don't know what's going on. They have no context at all for what's going on here. So their positionality to the giants and their reactions to them are so significant, so significant. You've got Judd, the guy who considers himself to be learned in the ways of society and history and politics and culture, who reacts entirely with horror and in fact is just destroyed by it. He's ultimately just crushed by it. There's nothing left of him by the end. Whereas Mick, who is, you would think is technically more the outsider by his very nature, actually finds himself wanting to be part of this. He sees a kind of artistry and he's desperate to be part of this mad giant.
Well, Mick's interested in religious art, isn't he, in churches? Yeah. He's interested in at least the history and tradition and I guess maybe at least the distant fascination of people coming together to worship.
But it's so fascinating, like the echoes and implications, because it's moribund, isn't it? This giant's going to die. It's already sickly. It's already mad. It's already dying. I mean, Barker describes like parts of it decaying already, right? There are people hanging dead from it. It's leaving a trail of corpses in its wake. So this thing is going to fail regardless.
Yeah.
And yet
people are dying in it, there's bits of it are dead like cells. So I mean there's a bit where they come across the the sort of like half mad despairing referee figure from one of the villages, and they're talking to him and they get some again a bit like a found footage horror or something, they get some sense out of him, and it's basically he describes this tradition as being the body of the state, the shape of our lives. It was a miracle.
I mean that's overt, Judd
amusingly dismisses as some Trotskyist tripe.
That's right. But again, though, I love that because that's Barker, like, tipping at least a halfway to the reader, like, yeah, I know. I know what I'm doing. You know that I know what I'm doing. And now.
But it's not didactic, is it? I mean, the story never comes across as like a screed or as a manifesto or anything like that. It's sort of teasing you with ideas and with the tensions that exist between characters and the places and the phenomena. That's what it's doing, and it's so gentle, oddly gentle for one of these stories.
But I think that's because what Barker does is he just commits to every point of view, and he commits to every point of view wholeheartedly. Yeah. You know, so when he's writing Judd is as believable and rational and well thought through as he can. When he's writing Judd's Party and when Mick, he does the same thing. And when he's writing about the cities and when he's writing about the townsfolk who form the cities, again, he's true to them. He's true to their perspective. He doesn't. I guess that's what I meant about him not feeling like he's sitting in judgment at any point. You know, he doesn't feel like he's got his thumb on the moral scale, because he imagines this tradition and he imagines what it must take for the people who participate willingly, and then he shows that. You know, and he does it without judgment, and I think that's what makes it so powerful, and that's what makes it so hard to kind of find a kind of straightforward morality tale here. Yeah,
because there isn't one, right? There isn't one. I mean, he's very careful about also avoiding like any of the innate politics of the towns. So this conflict that they're engaged in is a theatre, right? It's not literal. They're not killing one another when they become the giants. The fight is supposed to be a theatre. And
they don't hate each other, you know, they collaborate and swap notes and things like
that. Yeah.
I think that's really significant. The moment when they say like tomorrow we'll drink together and we'll swap tales, but today we have to be adversaries. You know, I think that's incredibly significant. Because again, you're talking about the power of ritual. Again, I guess, you know, and I think go on.
No, sorry, Kate. I interrupted there. Go on.
No, I was going to say, I think that the football analogy sort of bubbles back up into my mind. But the other question actually that does occur to me, and this is, I've recorded another conversation about this story recently, and this question came up there, but I'm going to throw it to you two. Like, what actually is this contest between these two giants?
This is what I was going to say. I mean, like, if you are aware of like the pagan roots of many of these rituals, of what permeates folk horror, then it's often the case that what has become symbolic acts were at one time, way back in the depths of prehistory, literal. So, you know, you start with human sacrifice. You literally have people's throats being slit into like the soil to create mortar, and their bodies buried in the foundations of buildings, right, to make them sacred. That progresses into the slaughtering of animals instead, and then it goes to hacking the necks off of amphora of wine, you know. I think that's what Barker's getting at here. You know, there is always blood and bodies and slaughter at the base of culture. And that's what this war probably was originally. They're probably referencing somewhere in the depths of prehistory some tribal conflict that was absolutely literal, but now has progressed and evolved to the level of being a theatre, but which ultimately, inevitably, ends in blood and slaughter and madness again. Accidentally, but inevitably, and that's fascinating.
There's something in that Kit, of that Star Trek episode you were talking to me about, A Taste of Armageddon, the one where they get in disintegration booths instead of fighting a war. You know. Absolutely. But were you kind of asking on one level what would have happened in the hills between these two giants if things hadn't gone wrong?
Well, here's the thing, right? Because like they do this every 10 years, and it cannot end that way every 10 years. Like what happens, is a catastrophe that is, effectively ends the tradition. Yeah. So what was the tradition up to that? What was the contest?
I've got a facetious answer to that, which goes back to Judd and Mick. I think they were going to fuck.
Now
we just didn't get that part of the anatomy described.
Wow, well, that would have been something for Barker to describe, right? I mean, how would the mechanics, for one thing?
Well, I joked to Kit that I was coming to this podcast with a silly joke, and the silly joke is that this is a story about the difficulty of maintaining an erection.
Oh my God!
I see what you did there.
Could happen to anyone.
Yeah,
but I mean, on a purely looking at the way he refers to the mechanics of these giants going together. I mean, I love, again, it's that gentleness, it's that subtlety where he talks about there are ligatures and there are ropes and there are mechanisms keeping them together. There are contortionists who are acting as the ligaments. I think there are babes in the eyes, aren't there? There are young people. Yeah. in the eye sockets who are the most clear sighted, and there are
that's really disturbing. That bit. I find that description really disturbing.
Yeah, it's amazing.
The specifics of it, isn't it? The specifics of who's assigned to what tasks,
Yeah, and it's the fact that he gets away with it. I mean, in the hands of a lesser writer, right? This people would have thrown this aside. This is ridiculous.
I think what's really telling is the way he does give the nods to physics. He describes this creature as being squat, so that it has a low center of gravity. Like, he talks about the relative limb length. Like, he's clearly thought about it.
Yeah, it's sort of not impossible, is it? It's just about possible if you squint.
Yeah,
right.
But it's still reaching that point of fairy tale, I think. Yeah. It's just on that wonderful interstice, and if it had gone one millimeter over one way or the other, it wouldn't have worked. But it just hits that right note where they are semi-magical, they're pseudo-magical, these creatures. They are almost mystical in nature, but not quite. They're grounded in flesh and muscle and bone and reality, and not just that, but political reality as well. Judd is kind of right. When Mick is bemoaning him at the beginning, when he says Judd is such a bore, everything is political. Everything is political. Sex is political, eating is political. It says farting is political at one point. And yet Barker kind of calls the bluff of that. He says, he may be a bore. He may be stating it in an aggressive way, but he is kind of right.
Well, the interesting thing, though, is that they're both right? Because Judd's right about everything's political, but also ultimately Mick's right that everything's aesthetics.
Yes.
Because ultimately Mick is seduced by the aesthetic of the giant and just chooses to become part of it for however long that's going to be. And I think it's very telling, by the way, that I think Barker is a very cinematic writer at times, and this is a particularly cinematic piece, actually. And I love how in the final, if you like, the final shot of the story, Mick is carried away by the giant, and then the camera stays on the body of Judd. And then we get this amazing time lapse, 24 hours of Judd's body and the vixen fighting over his, the meat on his thigh, and it's just
it's almost like a Nine Inch Nails video at the end.
That is, and that's where we stay. We don't get to see the giant and Mick and the inevitable, collapse. That's not where our camera. This story is told. We stay with the body of Judd, and I think that's really interesting because I think for me that does show maybe the only time in the story that maybe hints at Barker's ultimate sympathies, because I think. I think if you put a gun to the head of Barker and you ask him to choose between a political analysis and an aesthetic one, I think he will always choose aesthetics.
Always the aesthetic. Always. You know what I mean? And by extension, therefore, his sympathy would always be with Mick.
Yeah, exactly.
As opposed to Judd, Yeah.
Well, that's a really good juncture because I actually wanted to talk a little bit more predictably, perhaps, about the politics, but it's kind of to do with some of the stuff you guys have touched on already about the Cold War moment of it, and the symbolism of being away in the Balkans, for two British characters, and I wanted to talk about this because this is sort of based on, or at least it's built on, an initial misunderstanding of mine from reading it as a teenager, because I was a bit vague about when these were written. I knew they were works of the 1980s, but I think I read this as a teenager. And I, even at that age, I was much less political than I am now, but I read some politics into it. But I think I was misunderstanding them as being a product of the very tail end of the 80s or maybe even the start of the 90s. Right. And you'll probably see where I'm going with this, because obviously this is actually this is a work of 1983, 1984, isn't it? So what you're actually doing there is Barker's writing at the start, the very end of the sort of Brezhnev, Andropov era. He's writing at just the start of Gorbachev, really, at the start of what would become the Gorbachev reforms and the eventual complicated fall of the Soviet Union, for the Berlin Wall, etc. But this is years before that, and the reason I wanted to put this out there is see if you guys agree or find any valency in this reading, I guess. The thing I find reading it as an adult is that the towns of Popolac and Podojevo, they could be, I see it as this, it was almost without being too romantic, a sort of visionary piece of writing on Barker's part, a prophetic piece of writing is what I mean, really, because I think there's a good reading of Podojevo, the giant that collapses, as representing the Soviet Union and representing communism, and it's almost looking forward, seeing the signs, reading the signs. I think in one reading of that's the giant that dies, collapses, leaves many bodies and chaos in its wake, and I think you can see the giant Popolack, the giant that goes mad, from the tragedy, from the sort of innate contradictions and horror, then goes rambling away blindly and madly, to despair. Essentially, you could read that as capitalism. You could read that as what the other power block is going to do in the wake of this horror. There's a sort of end of history here.
Yeah, so there is a wider commentary, I suppose. Given that reading, there is a wider commentary upon the nature of ideological systems and societal structures, right?
Indeed,
which is
and of our systems.
They fail,
and I think that complicates as well. Mixed joining of it at the end, because he's not necessarily. Well, I don't think you guys were suggesting this, but he's not necessarily joining something that's alien and unknowable. Maybe he's fully enveloping something that he's always been living in the midst of.
That's it, and would have always been excluded from as a gay man, right? He's found a narrative and a system that he can be part of, but it's a lie, it's a myth. I know that Barker does describe the people who are still part of Popolack embracing him and drawing him up, but it's still going to he's still an outsider, and it's going to die. All of it is going to die, so it really doesn't matter. There is a wider there's a moribund nature to this story, and even like a nihilism, which is something we've commented upon before, which Barker will abandon later on when he comes to writing his novels and whatnot. But while he's here writing this version of Barker, there is a real nihilism when it comes to any kind of prescribed system or traditional ideology, or really, I think his nihilism, his political nihilism, is made overt in this story. It's soft, it's gently spoken, but again, you see it when you talked about that sort of the freezing of the camera at the end of the story kit, when it freezes on Judd, and what you get is a sort of like time lapse of entropy.
Yeah.
It's almost like, well, all things come to this. This is it, the giant doesn't matter. Mick doesn't matter. It's going to die and it's going to rot and it will fall eventually. Everything comes to rot and becomes fodder for something else, right?
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. I should say before, just while we're discussing the ending still, I suppose, I wanted to mention that the Mick being taken up into the giant, maybe at a point where he's got no good or sane options left, and you talk about him as an outsider as well, George. It's a bit like, obviously the influence is the other way around of it all, but it's a bit like the ending of The Witch, isn't it?
Yes, very much. The same. That's exactly. Thematically, The Witch is kind of an echo of this story, and vice versa. They are very, very, very similar. They're both sort of like exemplaries and subversions of the traditional themes of folk horror.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make, though. I think, though, the thing that fascinates me about because we do get a glimpse of Mick's interiority as he joins with it. He kind of falls in love, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of what happens. He kind of decides he wants to be Fay Ray to this thing's King Kong, right?
I'm sure that's kind of deliberate as well.
And whereas Fay Ray is a victim of circumstance and is a prisoner, really. Yeah. He is embracing it, like he chooses it.
Almost. Well, the guy in Close Encounters, right? The guy in Close Encounters leaves his wife in order to climb up into this construct. And
there's a kind of wider implication of the nihilism I was talking about earlier, in that this is a guy who, his homosexuality aside, which would certainly be a part of it, has been denied narrative of identity, right? That's a postmodern problem. That's actually a problem for all of us in postmodern society. We lack grand narrative, where all of the narratives of tradition have died. They've failed us. So we have nothing. We're left flailing for some sense of identity. And suddenly you have this grand mythological emergence, seemingly mythological emergence, that can provide it.
But I think as well, Barker understands the seduction, not just of aesthetics, but the seduction of something grand, something bigger than yourself. When we see Mick's thought process, part of it is just it's the beauty of it and the scale of it, and it's I'm paraphrasing slightly, but it's basically like, I'll never see anything this beautiful again. I'll never see anything even remotely like this. My life kind of is over. This is the peak.
So it reminds me of the sort of tradition of angels, as something terrible that can't be looked upon without going mad, and I suppose that's all over Barker, isn't it? Even I know enough to know that, that's one step away from the Cenobites, really.
And again, incredible ambiguity, because within the story he's not wrong. right?
Yeah.
He's not wrong. This
right.
is miraculous. This isn't a miraculous thing. It's okay. It's a confection of humanity, but it is a miracle of engineering and planning and just so many crafts and traditions all mingled together. He will not see anything like this again. No. And if you're going to die for something, then I can see the seduction of that. I can see.
You sort of suggested before that, Judd is snuffed out, and it's sort of implied by, the narrator, I guess, or by Mick's, mad consciousness that he just didn't deserve it. He didn't deserve his sight.
What I love about it as well is it's so arbitrary the way Judd does. I do believe it's not the giant as such. The giant, it's a piece of shrapnel, isn't it?
Right. It's a chunk of concrete from the house. Yeah, that's
it's
right.
What?
Yeah,
George, you may not want to sully this beloved Barker short story with the comparison I'm about to make here, but based on previous conversations we've had, I was getting, I guess this just shows how deep this is in my consciousness, as I know it is in yours as well, but I was getting quite a lot of the vibes of the last battle from this story. And I think what that is, it's because it's a story of a sort of apocalypse, I suppose. Mm-hmm. Because it's a story of this, the fact that you're getting this like destroyed farmhouse imagery and stuff doesn't help with that. But it's this idea of someone being swept along by increasing horrors and it becoming increasingly unimaginable. The universe sort of falling apart around them and them having to go. I guess it's that old cliche again, further up and farther in.
Yes, I think that's a really good shout, actually. Like thematically, absolutely. And I know for a fact Barker would have been aware of that because he is a huge fan of C.S. Lewis. Lewis is like one of his core. The Chronicles of Narnia are one of his core texts.
I mean, you and I have talked about this many times, George, but one of the things I think that I find so thrilling about Barker is he, his reputation is very much that of a punk, someone who rips up the rule book, someone who, burns it to the ground, someone who, is blazing a completely new trail. And I think what I find fascinating about Barker is I think the reality is much richer and more interesting than that. Barker is really steeped in the traditions of the storytelling that he's working in. He's not, I mean, there is a very traditionalist element to all of Barker's work, certainly in Books of Blood to this point. That he is dealing with ancient epic themes. He's dealing with themes about theatre. He's dealing with the devil. He's dealing with the underclass of cities and the notion of all that kind of like this is all there. And this is this again we talked about it. This is folk horror. This is kaiju. This is all this kind of stuff. What makes it fascinating is the way that Barker moves the ball forward, the way that Barker tells a tale that is somehow, and this is the trick that I can't understand. I understand why it was fresh at the time, contemporary at the time, exciting at the time. I don't quite understand why it still feels that way in 2023. That's kind of a conundrum for me.
Maybe even more so now, right? Yeah. Maybe even more so, given like the ideological tensions under which we're operating now. Maybe it's even more powerful and resonant, as you were discussing earlier, Kit. I mean, we now have, the problems we were discussing earlier with the notion of identity, which is profound in this story. It would have been significant for Barker as a gay man in the 1980s, obviously, and as an underclass man, it would have been massively significant because, of course, he would have been being told by society and culture in the UK, you are scum. That's your identity. Yeah. You are diseased filth. You're worthless, right?
Dangerous as well. You're dangerous.
Yeah, you are dangerous. You are actually verminous. You're parasitic, right? There is something. You are actually a worm in the belly of society. And I think that is even, that's arguably even more significant now.
I think there's something beautiful about the way Barker is, as you say, Kit, like sort of co-opting these older stories and these older sort of models into this sort of like very transgressive, very explicitly new kind of art. Because you talk about older like folk myths and horror myths and stuff. I mean, there's a bit of Dracula to this. You go into the hills of Eastern Europe and find a horror. There's a bit of Frankenstein. That horror involves stitching bodies together.
Well, I think Frankenstein is a key text for this one. It's a core text for understanding this one, without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, the difference is the monsters are not bemoaned as such. They are celebrated.
Well, and willing participants, right?
And willing, right. And also they're made of the living rather than the dead.
But you've got this is later in the Books of Blood, isn't it? But there's that story I remember later in the books that involves a sort of coalition of body parts and limbs and things that can go off on their own missions. I'm sure you guys will get around to that one.
The body politic.
That's it. Yeah. So obviously you're getting hints here of where Barker's going to go in the future.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, for me, this is the proto-sacrament. Later on, he will expound upon the themes and the concepts and even the images in this story. The fox at the end recurs as a sort of shamanistic, spiritual image in Sacrament. It's really fascinating. But what he will do in Sacrament is he will demonstrate how much he has evolved ideologically. So he will take the essential nihilism that exists in this story and he will countermand it quite powerfully. Quite powerfully by establishing a metaphysics for gay men,
right?
Specifically,
that is interesting. It almost feels like it's demanded by this story. I mean, you come away from the story wanting a metaphysics to hold on to.
Exactly, and that's what Sacrament provides you. It goes through all the stuff. It goes through all of this. The characters in Sacrament go through these annealing processes where they're lost, where they are outcast, where they're exiled, where they are traumatized, but they find something through that process. Whereas these characters are destroyed by it.
That's so interesting, and I definitely have to read Sacrament. That's definitely on the list.
Honestly, Sacrament is a one. That is so powerful.
Yeah,
I would say.
If you recommend anything that will help me process In the Hills of Cities, then I will gladly jump aboard that train.
It's I would say it's I would say it's essential reading for queer people. I really would, especially those who are struggling with their place or their identity, because it's not one of those sort of like peons of acceptance or tolerance where it says, oh no, you're okay. No, it doesn't say that. It's not interested in that. It's interested in you are efflorescent, you are transcendent. There is something special and innate within you as a human being that makes you potent and powerful and wonderful. It tells you that you are shamanistic by your very nature, which is beautiful.
And I think there's something even amidst the horror, because of the horror and sort of, indecipherableness of this story, that, that there's bits of that. There's bits of that optimism, because, I think Barker on one level is trying to get you to think about the common rituals that you participate in. Yeah. And I guess, a common ritual can be one-on-one sex, and it can be a football crowd, and as I said before, bonfire night, things like that, and he's making you think, what are you a part of, and what part do you play in it, and what do you think about that, and which I know is a grand theme. There was one thing I wanted to ask you guys about, actually, and it kind of comes back to the sort of Grand Guignol horror descriptions at the heart of the disaster in this. And I was at the start of the recording, I was talking about Hieronymus Bosch and that kind of thing, when trying to visualize this stuff, but. I kind of forget, and it's been great actually listening to you guys talk about the previous stories in the collection, like how funny Barker is such a lot of the time. Yeah. And a lot of the darkest humour in this comes during the scenes, and it's by Mick and Judd sort of having these bizarre, I guess already half-mad thoughts about, the rights and wrongs and the perceptibility of this and not, because they describe... there's one bit where the fallen Pajevo is described as a dynamite skyscraper, which for anyone post 9/11 that just becomes extremely resonant. Yeah. But I'm thinking about that is it Mick who starts to think that this he could deal with this disaster if the authorities turned up. He needs the authorities to turn up, and then he can relax because the horror will still be there, but it'll be known horror. And I suppose that's getting back to the sort of Dark Knight. It's all going according to the plan.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
But I like one of the funniest bits in it is when Barker's talking about the kind of logistics that would be needed to deal with doing the last rites. I noted it down here. He's saying you'd need an army of priests, a water cannon filled with holy water, a loudspeaker to pronounce the benedictions.
Yeah.
And he's just thinking about the scale of it and just describing what pragmatically you'd need to deal with this situation. And I'm just like, that's ludicrous, but it's dark. That's genuinely Python-esque, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a bleakness that's probably the bleakest single moment in the story as well, and it makes me think of since I'm thinking at the moment where the man is going around with his pistol and he's
wow.
He's dispatching with mercy and I think Barker's explicit about he's hunting out the youngest, and the most in pain to try and alleviate. But of course, there's the thing of like he's got X number of bullets and X thousand number of bodies. Like it's such a futile gesture, and it reminded me of, and this is kind of, I don't know, there's there is something comic about this, although the way Barker does it is an inversion of this. There's a kind of a famous, I can't remember where I first heard it, but it feels like one of those kind of chicken soup for the soul allegories, right? Guys down at the beach, and the beach is covered with starfish as far as the eye can see, and the tide's going out, the starfish are stranded, and they're kind of clearly, you know, going to be drying out in the sun, and there's just one person walking down the beach just throwing starfish back into the sea, and the observer goes up to the guy and it's like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, this beach is covered in starfish. What possible difference could you make? And the guy picks one up, throws it in the sea, and says, "Made a difference to that one."
Yeah.
I like that's like, but what I love is the way Barker flips that around in the story. It's like, yeah, but actually, what you're more likely to be faced with is you've got 14 bullets and 14,000 people that need putting down, and you better save one for yourself. Because you do not want to live with the memory of this fucking thing.
Well, I don't know if this was in time for Barker to see it. The story may have been finished already and sold by this point, but I note also that 1984 is the year that Threads is on television.
Yes, right.
You know, for people who don't know about that, you know, that's something.
Can I just put out, if you do go seek that out, just warnings, just content warnings.
A piece of political television in British history that's very controversial and was then and is now, and but obviously a lot of that deals with, you know, what you call palliative care for a mass disaster, shall we say?
It is one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen in my life.
I don't think I've ever fucking heard Threads referred to as palliative care. You're a sick man, David. I like
Thank
you
you
very much.
Thank you. Well, coming from either of you, that means a lot.
Apropos on this podcast, right?
Yeah, perfect. Absolutely perfect.
Well, I felt I had to earn my keep somewhat, given the topic.
But, you know, it's interesting because compared to that, you know, this, I mean, you could almost argue this story is comparatively optimistic, right?
Yeah.
Compared to Threads, you know.
God, yeah.
But I think it's interesting, like, you know, Barker's wrestling with the apocalypse there and the apocalyptic imagery. I mean, again, you know, early you described this, George, as one of the least graphic, and it is, and yet he manages to create this hellscape. Of bodies at one point, and actually one of my favorite moments, because it manages to teeter right on the very brink of Garth Marenghi and just pulls it back at the last minute, is the actual tidal appearance of blood.
I was thinking Garth Marenghi about that as well.
Because the prose almost gets there, and what brings it back from the brink is the reaction of the characters, and they ground the moment for you as the reader, and they pull it back from that, you know, that kind of blood you know. But it's, I mean,
that's almost like what people advertise the books of blood as, isn't it? You know, where you open the pages and just gore gushes out.
That's like Ash in Evil Dead 2 being sort of buffeted by the riot hoses. But I agree, it gets away with it. It
does. It's almost bizarrely, given the subject matter, it's almost like a moment of horror levity in the midst of this wider, deeper, more resonant tragedy and horror.
Well, it's more like it because it's so all encompassing. It's so landscape changing that it's almost more like the red weed from War of the Worlds or something.
Yes.
You know, it's this something's happened which has changed the very nature of the countryside. You know?
And what's interesting about it, of course, is that, you know, as the reader, it's that Hitchcockian thing. You know what's gone on, but the characters don't. They're just encountered with a tide of blood coming towards them down the hill.
And again, it's very telling that up to that moment, Judd's heard the booming of the giants and the giants' footsteps, and assumes that it's guns. He's got this fantasy of getting the Pulitzer, right? If he can uncover secret Soviet troop movements and whatever. So, like, he's, you know, again, his rational brain can't cope with what he sees. But yeah, I love. I mean, one of the things that I find really interesting about this is there is a moment where Barker acknowledges that the charnel house of European history, you know, when he said he actually asks the question, had there been this many bodies on a European battlefield before? Perhaps, but ... and then goes on to do the description. I think that's really interesting, and what you were saying there, David, about it changing the landscape, you know, an event so profound it changes the landscape itself, makes me think about the history of, like, the Mongol campaigns, the Genghis Khan's campaigns, where there was, I mean, I remember hearing about I think this was from the Dan Collins Hardcore History series on the subject, a moment where people were traveling into an area where Khan had been Genghis Khan had been like the year before, and the ground, the earth over a year later was still sodden, and was actually, the ground itself was sweating human fat from the number of bodies that were. Yeah. So there are those moments of human history where we, where there has been kind of carnage on this scale. But what's interesting to me is that, I think about that and I think, yeah, but they've always been caused by conflict, right? They've always been caused by wars and by, perhaps a mixture of a war and genocidal hatred. But I think the challenge of In the Hills, the Cities is Barker turning around saying, yeah, but isn't that all really just other words for tradition?
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Right. It's inevitable collapse, right? It's inevitable entropy. That's what he's commenting upon here.
All stuff we agree to do. And also, like, when you say about Judd there, suspecting that he might be about to get the Pulitzer, I mean, he's talking about more other traditions that go on in the countryside secretly, isn't he? About, hidden movements of troops that are at War Human Organization, more tradition, as you say.
Yeah.
Yeah, and because it's a Barker story, what's about to happen is infinitely more fantastic than that, of course.
And outside of Judd's scope, of course.
Because Barker's never going to knowingly side with the arch rationalist. But it is, you're right. It is interesting. And I think that, I mean, for me, because, the thing about the Cities is, what I love about it is it's simultaneously Barker attempting to realistically describe something that, as we said, it feels that very just right on the edge of potentially possible, right? And I love that he does that. I love the amount of effort he puts into that, because I think it sells the whole story and it makes it work. Because if it doesn't work on a kind of physical, mundane level, it doesn't work at all. The whole thing does fall apart at that point. But I love how it makes you think about, for me, it's like, it made me think a lot about societal structures in general, and about, and these are things that I've been thinking about a lot lately for my own work, I think, but about complicity, To what degree are you complicit in the actions of a society or a country that you happen to be born into? To what degree are you responsible for the actions of your government or your government's military? Or to what degree are you, because especially if there's an argument, in the West, there's always that interesting thing of like, well, there are ways in which you materially benefit from the fortune of having been born into a country where there is, relatively speaking, wealth, and where there is, relatively speaking, healthcare, and so forth and so on.
Well, and where there is, relatively speaking, military aggression.
Right, and those things are actually not a coincidence at all. It's the military aggression that stole the enormous wealth that fuels that life, that way of life. So I think, obviously, I love how Barker has it both ways. I love how he manages to say, yeah, of course, this is a metaphor, and no, this isn't at all a metaphor. This is actually just a thing that's really happening here in this secluded area of Europe. It's fucking brilliant. But I do think that thing about, because there's that, we're invited to recoil with horror at the notion of completely subsuming yourself to a bigger machine, and yet we're actually invited to do that all the time. And as David, as you pointed out, if the two giants do represent communism and capitalism, then actually we're no less invited to be part of that giant as in a capitalist society than we are in a Stalinist one. Right. Actually, it's, coincidentally or not, actually you're still invited to self-sacrifice, right? You're still invited to be a cog in a machine.
Well, it can often be get on board or be crushed as well. Right?
Well, I want to say invited, yeah. Exactly. That's, and again, that's where the in the Hills feels almost oddly optimistic, because it does have that thing of like, actually, as far as we know, everyone actually does want to be there. They all want to be doing it. And going back to that just briefly, David, to go back to what you were saying about the metaphor, because I love that idea that the two giants represent communism and Stalinism and capitalism. I like the notion, because if you think about the reason that the Stalinist city falls is because of the weakness that's created by a change of leader.
Yeah.
And again, that almost feels prophetic if you think about the history of the area of this country and what's about to happen when a long-term leader of the country dies. I think that's really interesting. And of course, it is prophetic, but it's also just an intelligent understanding of history. That is, it's very rare that powerful dictatorships successfully dynastically replicate themselves.
It's also so material because Barker says a bad decade of crops had produced bodies less well nourished.
You know what? I'm so glad you mentioned that because that's really fucking important.
Yeah, spines less supple, wills less resolute. That's what he says has happened. It's been because of essentially vitamins and nutrition. You know? And
again, what does that say? That says there's a wider power structure. You know what I mean? Like these two cities are trying to do this wonderful, terrible, terrifying, incredible thing in isolation, and they're trying to preserve this tradition, be part of this thing that they do. And I love that here we are, an hour and a quarter in, we still don't know what they do. We'll never know what they do. What did the Giants do when they met each other on the field? We don't know. We'll never know. We do know they didn't actually kill each other because they did it every 10 years. But whatever they did, but the idea that outside forces far bigger, far more elemental than even this incredible, spectacle have created, or at least have provided a proximate cause for the disaster because they're not well enough, they're not fit enough, they're not healthy enough.
That is very much it, isn't it? Again, it's this wider commentary upon the decay of ideology, right? There are also just the inherent weakness of these assumed structures. There is always going to be some outside or abstruse force or phenomena that comes along that exposes their weakness and proves terminal.
It's really interesting. It was a sheer coincidence, but I was listening to Steve Earle's 2002 album, I think, Jerusalem, today or yesterday. I'd been talking about it with a friend because I'm doing a Springsteen podcast, and we talked about The Rising, which is Springsteen's post 9/11 album, and Jerusalem is Steve Earle's post 9/11 album, and I think it's probably the best album Steve Earle ever did. I think it's an absolutely phenomenal piece of songwriting, and I do think it's better than Springsteen's effort, although I love that a lot as well. But the opening song on Jerusalem is called Ashes to Ashes, and it's obviously it was written, you can tell it was written maybe like the day after the Trade Center came down, because he's building to this metaphor of every tower ever built crumbles, but the whole thing is like 3 verses and it's quite biblical, it's quite Old Testament, a lot of the imagery it uses, but it kept coming back to me like every tower ever built crumbles, every empire that's ever been raised falls, and it's like I kept feeling echoes of that in this story, kind of it on one level it's almost about just the inevitability of time itself as an entropy factor, right? But it also kept making me think about, and this is something that really profoundly bothers me, and I can't even really describe myself as a student of history. I'm like, if I am, I'm the guy who sits at the back picking his nose and doesn't listen most of the time. Like I'm a very lazy kind of, but I'm fascinated by the history of our species. And I do spend time here and there kind of dipping into various areas that I'm interested in learning about. But I think one of the things that I think makes history such an important thing, and it almost doesn't matter what you study as long as you study some period or other, and I wish more people did, because it gives you a bone deep understanding of how incredibly fragile so many of the structures that we think of as permanent really are, and how ephemeral they are, and how subject to change without notice they are. And I think if people had a better grasp of that, they'd be a little more alert to the warning signs.
Yeah, definitely.
When a society is
maybe circling back to the start of the story, as we talk about, there's something about that lesson being taught to these 2 young, beautiful men, right? Who are enjoying each other's forms and enjoying being young, for all the bickering and everything like that, and they're taught this horrible lesson of entropy.
Well, there's something about Barker's own positionality, of course, here coming through as well. Again, as a gay man in the 1980s, as an underclass man in the 1980s, he would be able to see that rot from the inside. He would be in the sickest part of the belly of the beast, as it were.
Yeah, and he'll also have seen the some of the lengths and indeed depths to which the power structure will sink to keep those. That's it, exactly. Again, it's this. There's almost like a confessional aspect here. It's Barker talking about his own position and perspectives as a result of the various factors that have thrust him outside the fishbowl, as it were. Yeah.
It's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I mean, this is like, you came to this quite recently. What was your reaction to the story in context with the other stories that you've read thus far?
I mean, the obvious joke to make is that it's head and shoulders above them, but I think
yes.
Except it's not. I mean, this is the thing. It is, but it's also. I think what's wonderful to me about it is of a piece.
Yeah.
All the stuff I've already talked about how all of Barker's work that I've read so far is clearly grounded and rooted in actually quite a deep understanding of the storytelling tradition and what comes before.
Mm-hmm.
And I adore that. I adore how he takes all that and manages to create something that, as I say, still feels fresh in 2023. That's an incredible achievement, and it did to me. I think I was lucky to be unspoiled, given how freighted this story is and how widely discussed it is. And as you say,
I can't believe you haven't come across it before, to be honest, operating in the arenas that you do, because it's even more pervasive than I thought, to be honest.
The thing about it is like people don't talk about it. What people do is they just look at each other and go, "Oh my God, the hills, the cities."
That's it.
We sound like mad prophets ourselves.
Yeah. But no one talks about the content of the story.
You're absolutely right. Isn't it crazy? People will they will just do that thing of like, oh, in the hills, the cities, and they'll just expound on how great it is, right?
Well, I think there's something as well, George, as you said, there's that comic book adaptation, which I'd love to look into, but this is kind of, and you can say this about a lot of the stories in the collection as you guys go on, I guess, but like this is gloriously unadapted apart from that, so it's not it's not over familiar, and there is a sort of lessened impact to even some of Barker's most interesting material, like Candyman and Hellraiser, because it's well known, because it's iconic, and when you make something iconic, you do also subtract stuff from it, I think.
Yes, I mean, I'm so in love with the idea of this being a found footage film. I think that would be the perfect format for it now.
But it's really interesting what you say there, David, because obviously you'll have heard at some arguably too much length, George and I, bemoaning the kind of relative paucity of Barker adaptations compared to many of the other writers of his generation, and considering how, especially when you consider how cinematic so much of his work certainly feels to be to me. But I guess you're right. The flip side of that is that you don't end up with that situation of like being spoiled via pop culture, right? I mean, like if you're a kid growing up now, you're going to know quite a lot about The Shining before you ever see The Shining, because a combination of The Simpsons and Ready Player One and what the fuck ever. Do you know what I mean? Like
it's become a myth, hasn't it? It's become part of cultural context.
Yeah, and of course there's an enormous kind of, and specifically kind of the movie version as well, and no doubt to King's sort of grumpy shring. But the point is, like, it obviously there's that's an incredible compliment both to King as a writer and Kubrick as a filmmaker, that it's become a cultural touchstone. But it does mean that you can't go in and be unspoiled. I think the silver lining, if you like, admittedly, it is kind of a travesty that Barker's stuff hasn't been adapted, but the silver lining is it means that it is still possible, again, in 2023, to go in unspoiled and experience these stories, completely fresh. And that is an enormous privilege. It's an interesting thing. Like, there's a lot of discussion on, wider. I see a lot of this, especially in cultural criticism quarters, about spoilers, about whether or not they're really significant or not, whether or not they really matter. And there is a strain of thought that actually being familiar with spoilers can enhance your experience of a piece of work rather than diminish it. And I understand that argument intellectually, but I've got to be honest, for whatever reason, my own personal preference is not to be spoiled. I love the feeling of experiencing something for the first time with little or no expectation. I love being caught out by a twist. I love, I love when a sentence or an idea or a concept lands with the force of revelation. And again, for me, the moment in this story where, having convinced myself Barker was never going to describe this thing in any great detail, he was going to keep it with these hints and these kind of insinuations and these sort of really close up details, and then suddenly you get and he just let rip, you know, and you get this awe-inspiring description. And it's great because for me, I feel when I read that, I feel that same rush of endorphins that I felt as a kid seeing, you know, King Kong for the first time. You know, that sense of scale and power and maybe a bit of madness too. But so what? Because look at it. It's fucking amazing. And it might eat you, but who cares?
Who cares?
Look at
it. It's that Ogden Nash thing of wherever there's a monster, there's a miracle, right?
Right. And for obviously the genius of Barker is that he can do that in prose. You know, he can, you know, in a short story, in a few hundred words, he can conjure up this incredible image in your mind that is the equal of any of the great movie monsters of history. Like, I mean, you could go off someone, couldn't you? You know what I mean?
Oh, like, it's insane. I mean, the guy. I mean, it's a tension actually that Barker is consistently obsessed by, which is it's the unspoken terror of angels and the beauty of demons. Right? It's that strange tension whereby you can be attracted to something which is ostensibly horrific and horrified by something which is ostensibly beautiful.
Well, it's one of the. I can't remember if you guys have made the comparison on this show before, but it's one of the reasons that one of the artists I would compare Barker to isn't really a writer, but it would be more like H.R. Giger, you know.
Absolutely.
They're both creating nightmares essentially, you know, and obviously with Giger, you know, this is art, but a lot of that's transmitted via, you know, creative film directors and amazing film directors. But Barker's using, as you say, sometimes quite conventional story types and traditions and stuff to convey the unimaginable, you know, and it's I think that's a big part of the punch still, you know.
But yeah, I think for me, this one, he is firing on all cylinders, isn't it? This
Absolutely.
one, he definitely. I think this one is more of an evident sort of first step for what will come much later. There are ideas and images and all, even like ways of writing here that are highly redolent of the novels that will be coming a little later.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think I see some of literally some of the scale, right, of Imagica. You can see the edges of that. And I guess there's a thing about, as a writer, just building a confidence that you can just do it, right? And I mean, I don't think Barker has ever been a writer particularly lacking in confidence.
No, definitely not.
But you can sort of see how you write something like this and think, okay, that is something I can do.
Yeah, well, I suppose, I mean, even like, you know, down to base images, Hepexamendios, right? His body is made out of a city.
Yeah, exactly. And you feel like you can see the seeds of that here. You feel like you can see because this is clearly, one of the things that's joyous, I think, about Books of Blood, and I think the rule breaking that George, you and I have analysed at some length now is very much a symptom of this. This is a young writer. This is a young writer in love with the act of storytelling, just completely in love with the act of storytelling via the medium of prose, and he is just the enthusiasm is completely infectious and is just in every single page, and that wonderful kind of, I mean, I don't want to, you know, naivety is not the right word, because he's very well read, he's very well storied even at this point in his career, but there is a kind of, I don't know, innocence maybe is the word I'm looking for, that just doesn't even, you know, like, because it doesn't feel to me like he's doing the head hopping to say, fuck you, I can do head hopping in a short story and it still works, look at how great I am. He just does it because it's what the story needs to do.
Right,
so
I think it's not conscious, is it? He just does it, right? It's like, it's what the story wants, so that's what happens.
And again, it's that thing of like, I think that's why I think that kind of punk moniker is a little bit of a, you know, represents a little bit of a misunderstanding of what Barker's doing. Because he does break some rules, but he's not breaking the rules for the sake of breaking rules. He's doing it purely in the service of the story he's trying to tell. And
I think some of those writing, sorry to interrupt you, some of those writing rules that I've heard you guys you know, talk about before, you know, obviously, you know, usually fairly dismissively, but, you know, in terms of their sort of more traditional creative writing advice, that kind of thing, I think some of that is just outdated, and not because it was maybe never right. But I think there's something we've been talking about, sort of filmic appreciation, and comparing this to visual art, and thinking about cross-cutting and things like that. And you talk about inner monologues in film and the way they're used. This head hopping thing. I think some of this older creative writing advice is maybe just not needed anymore for a more media literate and multimedia literate audience. I think there's some ways in which Barker might have been at the forefront of, I'd have to read up more about it really, but, about some of his techniques are just newer, younger techniques that people can follow more easily now. If you have, obviously you need a fair degree of literacy to follow these Barker stories. They are quite ornate to a degree, but you both talked about how punchy and readable they are still as well. And sometimes I think
absolutely.
some of that, I think it's not just him, not following rules for a sheer fuck you attitude, or not following rules that you don't. I think it's him identifying rules that he thinks are not necessary anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a really good shout. And I think, obviously we'll know that from this point he will go on to, be involved in cinema and write a couple of scripts and direct as well, very successfully. And I think you're right. I think he has not entirely. He does know how to use. He is aware of the things that prose can do that cinema cannot, and he's quite ruthless about exploiting in the best possible way. He's quite ruthless about exploiting those strengths,
and it's commented upon it at length as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and we talked about that, didn't we? Like, that's you can't actually adapt Imagica, because the plot twists in Imagica would never work if it was film. It's one of those things that it would only work in a book. It's really amazing. But I do think that we've remarked on how cinematic his writing is, but I think you've really I think you're right there, David. I think that's he's writing as someone who is himself literate in cinema and is just assuming his readers are, and he's probably right, because by the time you get to the 80s, who hasn't seen movies?
Yeah, right. Also, I think it's disinterest as well when it comes to things like rules and regulations for creating or write. I just don't think he's interested. I don't think he cares, And
some of that might be an instinctive, as I say, ability to identify what is necessary and what isn't,
Yeah, he's very interested in the visceral and the instinctive and what feels correct. And very often, because that's what he does, it feels sincere. And that's 99.9% of the effort, isn't it? If you can get that, if you can do something sincerely, the technical stuff almost doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think he's extraordinarily technically gifted, and again, I don't know to what degree that's innate, to what degree that's instinct, or to what degree he'd worked on it for a long time. But I'm continually astonished by his sentence level prose and how extraordinarily readable it is.
Oh yeah, it's beautiful. The way it's the way he exploits the ambiguity of language. I've always found this really fascinating with Barker. He puts together conjunctions of words that unlock contexts and significances that I've never conceived of before, but which make total sense.
There was one line I didn't get around to quoting before when we were talking about the disaster of Popolac or disaster of Putujevo, and it's where, again, Mick's thinking about a more processable version of this disaster with emergency services turning up, and he describes it as, in his optimism, I suppose, having all the rights and paraphernalia of a civilized disaster. And I think that might be one of my favourite sentences I've ever read.
Right.
That's so good. And again,
he's always got the right words,
Yeah. And again, that's like, what is this, like 20 years prior to Heath Ledger's, Dark Knight speech, right? Which is the one that I immediately think of when I hear that, and it's like, oh right, but this is like 84.
Yeah, right.
And it's essentially the same line, right? It's that whole kind of like, when it's going according to plan, right? Even if the plan is horrible, it's the spirit of that.
Absolutely, same implication, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just extraordinary stuff.
Wow. So, I'm so glad that this one I was almost intimidated by, I'll be honest, because 100%. You kind of you want to do it justice, don't you?
Yeah.
And it's kind of hard to, because it's just as the content of the story is itself, the delivery is just kind of sanity testing, right?
Yeah.
It's just so kind of,
it sounds flippant in a way, but the only thing really I can say is, please go and read it. Go forth and read this story. It will not disappoint. It's almost essential reading.
Yeah, I'm glad to have gotten around to this collection as a whole. And I'm, and as listeners of previous shows will know, I've gotten a lot out of every story we've read so far. But yeah, I do now understand why every single person that we contacted said, "Can I come on and talk about the Hills of Zeus?" Jesus Christ!
Yeah, and I feel very, very lucky that I got in under the radar. It's great. I really appreciate this. And this is you guys at the end of volume 1, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah, it is. Right. Wow, cripes.
So I don't know if we want to, in conclusion, spend a few minutes talking about our feelings about volume 1 as a whole. I mean, obviously, George, you have. I don't know how many times you've read this. Now, it's been a few.
I wouldn't be able to tell you. I can't count.
Have you gotten anything new out of this?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, totally. It happens every single time, and it happens every single time I come to read anything by Barker, to be perfectly honest, despite being so familiar with it. Again, it's that whole thing of, it's never the same river, is it? It's never the same river. It's never the same person walking through it. There's that element. You're coming at it with new context. You're seeing new things. But this time round, I think I'm coming at them more as a writer now, right. And more as an experienced writer. And it's awe-inspiring. Mm. It's awe-inspiring. I mean, the craft on display here, the imagination, and the balls. Yeah. On a purely visceral level, the absolute balls of this guy is unbelievable. That's always impressed me with Barker. The fact that he's always willing to go further, to give you more, to give his readers more in the way of credit than the vast majority of his contemporaries. He treats his readers with such incredible respect. It's that key thing with really good writing, where it doesn't pretend to be smarter than its readers.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
The point you make about respect is interesting, because for me, I think the respect manifests in two ways, and one of those ways is that he doesn't lowball what he's doing in terms of his imagination or conceptually. Like, he's prepared to throw gigantic, I mean, figuratively and literally, gigantic ideas on the page and let them sit with you. But I also think that respect comes from, I keep coming back to it, I know, but comes from his readable prose. Yeah. Like, he does not indulge in any of the tics that so infuriate me in a quote unquote literary writer. And there are a handful of truly great literary horror writers. And I doff my caps to them because they're incredible. But I think most people who try at that fail. But I think what I love is Barker clearly, he as much as he has this oversized imagination and these incredible concepts, he also clearly has a deep, sincere, and abiding love of pulp.
Yeah.
And totally. For me, the way that he, the other way he respects his audience is by being fucking entertaining.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think he draws distinction, to be honest, Kit. I don't think he's got that division in his mind. Insofar as Barker is concerned, the people who are reading and loving horror, science fiction, and fantasy are just as intelligent and just as discerning and considered and open to big philosophical, ideological ideas as people who are reading Dostoevsky or whatever, any prescribed text. He doesn't see any difference, I don't think.
No, I think that's right. But also for me, like, what I love about Barker as well, because he also clearly likes fun.
Yeah, God, yeah.
Always an attractive quality.
He's always said, actually, I mean, in the interviews and whatnot that he's always done, he's always said, like, if it comes down to the choice between making a good point and having like a profound idea or giving someone an erection, he'll go for the erection every time.
That's an amazing quote.
He will go for the visceral every single time.
Yeah, but I mean, what about you, David? Because obviously you've listened to these. I don't know if you've been rereading as you've been listening. That would be incredible. But either way, like, what what are your overall feelings about Volume 1 as you happen to be here for the last story?
Well, I have done a fair bit of that, actually, the rereading as you guys have gone along. Not beyond where you've gone, actually. I've got a volumes 1 to 3 book handy on my shelf, so I will be carrying on and sort of pacing myself with you guys' episodes. It's been incredible. I was saying to you on messaging before, Kit, that I particularly enjoyed, for some reason, you guys revisiting, I think, elements of the Midnight Meat Train that I hadn't ever picked up on before, about sort of symbolism and stuff like that, which is really interesting. I would say that the Midnight Meat Train, looking back over this collection as a whole, I think pairs quite nicely with In the Hills, the Cities.
Because there thematically, definitely.
Definitely, yeah, and I think I think actually I had another point to make about that, which again is a bit more flippant, but I really enjoyed revisiting the Yattering and Jack, because I think more than anything else in this volume, that was my reminder that these stories can do anything. There was this comic tone to it, and as you guys rigorously kind of went into, there was a whole bunch of, it's just such a patient story, and it's such a thorough story, but it's so funny throughout.
But also slapstick, right? It's Barker doing slapstick with a demon. It's like, all right.
Yeah. So I think if you guys have brought forward, one thing for me it is a reminder of the breadth of these things, and as you say, the kind of you never step in the same river twice thing, George. I'm now a different person than when I initially discovered these stories, and I think I and anyone else who encountered them a while ago will get more out of them, or different things out of them now at a different life stage, and that's made me really determined to revisit them. The flippant thing I was going to say, trying to sum up this volume as a whole, is I was trying to think, does anything tie all these stories together? And I'm not sure if anything ties them all together, apart from Barker's craft and imagination. But I was thinking, if you want to tie the Midnight Meat Train to In the Hills, the Cities, Barker is a outcast, creative, bohemian young man who's had a long history of unemployment, and the dole, etc. They're kind of both about the horror of being given job offers, right? Being consumed into larger structures that you might want to be part of. I mean, the Yattering and Jack even ends with the Yattering having to work for Jack. It's like the horror of. I was just thinking, if you go back to another writer who was making his mark, in the mid '80s, it's the I was looking for a job and now I found a job, and heaven knows I'm miserable now. It's I didn't mean to be that Mancunian, but it was. I think the themes are interestingly intertwined in this collection. Barker's writing is fascinating, and the breadth of these and the reminder of the breadth of these has made me so excited to read more.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, though I have to say, genuinely, I think you're probably right. Actually, for Clive Barker, what is a more ultimate horror than gainful employment? I actually like. I mean, it's funny. It's funny, but it's not. It's
a joke, but I think you're right.
There's something to that. He's like, well, okay, I'm starving to death and I might be beaten up by random football hooligans or the police at any moment for the fact of being gay, but
there's horror and then there's horror.
At least I don't work in a bank.
Yeah, right. I'm sure he must have said something to that effect somewhere in an interview. It wouldn't have surprised me in the least. I know that he's very proud of the fact that he was unemployable.
Yeah, not just unemployed, but unemployable.
Oh, no, unemployable. He was actually told that by his dole officer once.
Nice.
That's brilliant.
You are unemployable.
Perhaps a small part of his mind was trying to write things which would guarantee he would remain unemployable. at least in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing, is that there is a kind of element of throwing your cap over the wall with this fucking collection, isn't there? It's like, I don't think you're going back to what Stephen King described as polite society after this one.
No.
Certainly not in the mid-'80s, no,
definitely. Yeah, and I think for me, as I say, I think the thing it's a joy to do it, and it's a joy to be able to come to it fresh and then have these conversations with you, George, about the history with it. I mean, that's been a pleasure in and of itself.
It's brilliant. Honestly, it's a pleasure and an honor. It really is.
But I think for me, the overriding experience has been, just the sense of freshness. That's what I keep coming back to. I cannot believe how raw and vital and energetic this still feels, and how original it still feels.
Yeah, that's the thing that gets me every single time. These stories, I mean, there are like Barkerian traditions now, right? I consider myself part of them. Those of us who have grown up reading Barker and now write our own fiction, which is heavily influenced by this guy. Those of us like Haley Piper and Paula Dash and so many of us. And yet, these stories still feel so unique, despite the existence of these entire traditions informed by them.
Yeah, but I think it's just, for me, it just comes back to the singularity of Barker as an artist. I think that's, and I've always been a fan, absolutely, but I think one of the things this process has done is cement Barker's reputation and ability in my own mind as truly one of the greats, one of the very best to ever do it.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't help compare him to his contemporaries, and I feel bad about that sometimes because I love most of his contemporaries too. I really do, but it's like Stephen King said, it's that infamous quote, right? He makes us look like we've all been asleep for the last 10 years.
A decade. Yeah. No, it does. And again, but weirdly, and still asleep now, because
kind of, yeah.
Because we are in 2023, and I'm still reading it and going, well, fuck, I've never read anything remotely like that in my life.
Yeah. Exactly that. It's idiosyncratic, isn't it? It's its own phenomena. He is like one of those weird creative miracles that it almost makes you feel incredulous about reality. It's that kind of thing where you're like, okay, maybe we are living in some weird simulation or something. I don't know.
It's Clive Barker's world. We just live in it. You know?
Oh God, I wish that were true.
So do I.
I wish that were true. It would be a far more interesting world.
Anyway, but I mean, what a joy, and roll on volume 2 as far as I'm concerned.
Cannot wait.
I can't wait.
I can't wait. I'm already on Human Remains, so you know I'm well. I may have even finished volume 2 actually. I think I may be on volume 3. Yeah. Anywho, well, guys, brilliant. Honestly, this has been wonderful. It's been so good. Not only getting into the story, but catching up.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really do appreciate it. And it's been amazing talking about this, and I've been really looking forward to it.
Honestly, no, it's been great. This is always a joy. It's always a sincere joy. I mean, God, talking about Barker, talking about Barker's work, how can you not possibly enjoy that? Before we go, as per usual, guys, is there anything you want to pimp out?
You go ahead, David, as the guest.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, you can find me over at the EscapeGoat Podcast, which, as of time of recording this, has just put out episode 58, which featured the wonderful Jack Graham that people might be familiar with around these parts.
Oh, you absolutely will.
Yeah, it's a good one. So about Agatha Christie, and there's going to be another one out by the time this is out, so I hope that'll be fun too. You can get me on, you can get the podcast on at EgoatPod, ego_pod rather, at Twitter, and you can get me personally at D_Faggiani. On Twitter as well, and we're on YouTube, Spotify, and the and Apple Podcasts, and both these gentlemen that I'm recording with tonight have been on wonderful episodes of the EscapeGoat Podcast, which are amongst my most cherished episodes of that we've ever put out. So I really would encourage people to check them out.
It was a pleasure, as always, and as per usual, guys, links to all of that down below. Okay, Kit.
Yeah, as for me, I think if you listen to this and you've enjoyed my kind of analysis of these stories and you want more of that in prose form, then I think I'm going to recommend My Life in Horror Volume 2 is probably the best home for you to find that at the moment. That's there's a Volume 1 as well, which I also recommend. That's similar to what you've heard today. That's me discussing in prose form the childhood influences on me as a horror writer. I do analyze some of the classics of the 80s, such as 80s and 90s, such as Candyman and Stephen King's It and things like that, but I also cast my net a little wider, talk about music and cinema and even cultural events. So if that interests you, if you've enjoyed what you've heard, My Life in Horror Volumes 1 and or 2 are all available now. Usual places, bookstores for the physical copies and Amazon for the ebooks. My Life in Horror, of course, is an ongoing project over at Ginger Nuts of Horror. I think George may be talking to you about that in a few minutes.
Yeah.
So keep your eye on the website for new articles in that series. If you want my fiction work, then again, Amazon. If you find my author page on Amazon on Kit Power, all of my published works are there. Where possible, please do buy direct, either from the independent publishers concerned or from your local bookshop for the physical copies. Again, for ebooks, Amazon is fine. And if you would like something new from me every single week in exchange for as little as $1 a month, patreon.com/kitpower. Sign up for $1 a month and you'll get something new. Sometimes it will be a podcast, either exclusive or early access. Sometimes it will be an essay, a book review. Sometimes it'll be an excerpt from a piece of fiction that I'm working on. But if you like that kind of eclectic mix of things and you want to help support me in my work, that's the best way to do it. Thank you.
Excellent. As per usual, guys, links to all of that below. As for me, you can find me knocking about here on Exaggerated Elegy. All sorts going on around here at the moment. Doing one of my favourite things I've ever done, which is Hannibal Digested. Jack Graham and Elliot Chapman and I are chatting about the episodes of Brian Fuller's Hannibal. We're currently up to episode 5, I do believe. And that's just brilliant fun. I mean, my favourite TV show ever made. Probably take it to my grave as my favourite television show ever, because it's Mads, isn't it? You know, can't help it. Cannot help it. As Kit mentioned, I've now taken over the My Life in Horror series, which you can find at gingernutsofhorror.com. There are 2 articles currently waiting to be published. One about the necessity of pride this year. One about the Jim Henson film Labyrinth, which is a really, really big one for me. Again, David Bowie, you know, can't help it. It probably explains a lot about me, that film, actually, and I go deep into it in this article. I really, really do. As an extension of that, there is our sister channel, Our Lives in Horror, which is going to be having some new interviews put up very, very soon. Links to that below. With regards to my published fiction, you can find links to it over at strangeplaygrounds.com. Keep an eye out over the next 6 weeks, because there are going to be 2 new short stories published in the Kevin J. Kennedy collections. One in a collection of essentially kaiju horror stories, big gigantic monster horror stories, which is great fun to write, and another one in a collection of science fiction horror stories, which I was dead pleased to be published in. Dead pleased about that one. And if you fancy chatting to me, you can come and chat to me over for the time being anyway, at Twitter, at Enigmatic Elegy. We'll see how long that lasts, or how long it's even possible, right? But with that, guys, thank you once again. That was utterly brilliant. And thank you guys for listening. Until next time, bye-bye.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.